South Bend, Indiana, December 20th, 1963. A bitter gray wind whips across the 6 million square feet of the Studebaker complex, but there is something missing. The usual bite of ozone and hot oil is gone. Instead of the rhythmic thud of pneumatic hammers or the sizzle of welding torches, there is only an unmistakable reality of silence that has settled over the city like a shroud. Outside the massive gates, 7,000 men and women stand shivering in the slush, their breath visible in the freezing air. They aren't waiting for the morning whistle. They are clutching pink slips in hands that have spent decades forging the most beautiful cars in America. For these families, Christmas wasn't a celebration that year. It was a wake for a 114-year-old empire, a company that had survived the Civil War, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression, only to be brought to its knees in the middle of the most prosperous era in American history. Just 13 years earlier, in 1950, this plant was the humming heartbeat of the region. 23,000 workers clocked in every morning, turning out more than 343,000 vehicles a year. It was an industrial cathedral, where a job was an inheritance, and the factory whistle didn't just mark time. It organized the life of every soul in the city. But as the final car, a Lark sedan, rolled off the line that afternoon, the lights were cut and the cathedral of horsepower was left to rot in the snow. How does a company that defined American craftsmanship for a century vanish in a single decade? How does the last independent automaker lose a war to competitors who often built inferior machines? Was the fall of Studebaker an act of fate, or the merciless arithmetic of a management that fell in love with its own history and forgot to watch the horizon? Did your grandfather carry a Studebaker badge? Share your family's story in the comments below. I'm your host, and this is Industrial Aftermath. Now, let's begin. To understand the unmistakable reality of silence that settled over the South Bend ruins in 1963, we must first travel back to a world of fire, iron, and a different kind of grit and obsession. The Studebaker story does not begin in a corporate boardroom, but at a glowing forge in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was there that John Studebaker Sr., a German immigrant whose ancestors had arrived in America in 1736, hammered out a living as a blacksmith. He didn't just teach his 5 sons, Henry, Clement, John Moeller, Peter, and Jacob, how to shape metal. He taught them the unforgiving mathematics of industrial integrity. He told them that a name meant nothing if the work fell apart, a lesson that would become the foundation of an empire. In 1852, the industrial ambition of the family pushed 2 of the brothers, Henry and Clement, to look toward the horizon. They packed their blacksmithing tools and headed west to South Bend, Indiana, a place where land was cheap and the future felt unwritten. They arrived with a total of $68 between them, a sum that required a level of merciless arithmetic just to survive. They rented a small shop, barely large enough for 2 men to turn around in, and set to work with a singular focus on quality. In that first year, laboring from dawn until the last embers of the forge died at night, they produced exactly 2 wagons. But those 2 wagons were more than just vehicles. They were a monument to industrial ambition. Every joint was hand-fitted, every wheel perfectly balanced, and every piece of hardware forged to exceed the customer's expectations. It was here, in the dirt and heat of that tiny shop, that the brothers adopted the motto that would define the company for the next 100 years: always give more than you promise. In an era of frontier shortcuts and cheap materials, Studebaker became a name synonymous with a sacred industrial compact. By the 1860s, farmers and merchants across the Midwest would wait months for a Studebaker wagon, rather than buy a cheaper alternative that might break down on a muddy road. The transition from a small shop to a global giant required a massive infusion of capital, and it arrived through a high-stakes gamble that sounds like a piece of American folklore. In 1858, their brother John Moeller returned from the California gold rush. He hadn't found his fortune with a pickaxe in the mines. He had found it by building wheelbarrows for the miners. He stepped off the stagecoach with $8,000 in his pockets, a staggering fortune at the time. Instead of retiring to a life of leisure, he bet everything on his brother's vision, handing over every penny to expand the family business. This $8,000 infusion transformed the Studebaker brothers' manufacturing company. They were no longer just blacksmiths. They were becoming the architects of American movement. The small shop was replaced by the first bricks of what would eventually become a 6 million square foot industrial cathedral. By the 1870s, they had achieved the impossible, becoming the largest vehicle manufacturer in the world, shipping 75,000 wagons annually to every corner of the globe. But beneath this triumph, the brothers never forgot the oath of the forge. They believed that as long as they gave more than they promised, the rhythm of hammers would never stop. They were at the absolute zenith of the wagon age, unaware that the very man who funded their empire, John Moeller, would eventually be the one to declare that the horse was doomed, forcing the company into a new race against the unforgiving mathematics of the motor age. The quality was in, the name was on, and the Cathedral of South Bend was ready to face the 20th century. The year 1861 arrived not with a whisper, but with the roar of cannon fire at Fort Sumter. Across America, the unmistakable reality of a nation divided meant that industry was no longer a matter of private commerce. It was a matter of national survival. For the Studebaker brothers in South Bend, the Civil War acted as a violent catalyst that transformed their modest blacksmith shop into the arsenal of expansion. The Union Army did not just need men, it needed an unprecedented infrastructure of movement. They required an endless supply of ambulances to carry the wounded and gun carriages to transport the weight of artillery through terrain that was often more mud than road. The military contracts were not distributed lightly. They were governed by a set of unforgiving mathematics. The War Department demanded specifications that would have broken a lesser manufacturer. Axles had to support specific, punishing weights. Wheels had to survive the brutal, unpaved roads of the American South, and every joint had to hold up under conditions that would literally shake inferior vehicles to pieces. But the brothers, still governed by the oath of the forge they had learned from their father, met every requirement and exceeded them. They didn't just build wagons. They built monuments to industrial ambition that kept rolling when others failed. Officers in the field began writing letters back to Washington, praising the Studebaker name for its reliability in the heat of battle. This was a reputation forged in the fire of the American tragedy, providing the company with a brand loyalty that could never be purchased with simple advertising. When the smoke finally cleared and the war ended, veterans returned home with a deep memory of the wagons that hadn't let them down. The resulting post-war boom was nothing short of staggering. By the 1870s, the small rented shop of the 1850s was a ghost of the past, replaced by a sprawling, industrial cathedral in South Bend that organized the entire rhythm of the city. The factory complex had become a labyrinth of brick and iron, where more than 1,000 workers labored in a choreography of organized chaos. The rhythm of hammers was now the heartbeat of the region, and the American Industrial Compact was being written in the steady paychecks of men who took pride in the Studebaker badge. By the mid-1870s, the numbers told a story of absolute global dominance. Studebaker had achieved the impossible. They were no longer just the pride of Indiana, they were the largest vehicle manufacturer in the world. At their peak during this era, the factory was churning out a staggering 75,000 wagons every single year. These were not merely for the farmers of the Midwest. They were becoming the literal wheels of global civilization. Studebaker wagons were being created, crated, and shipped to every continent on Earth, from the ports of Europe to the mountains of South America and the vast expanses of Asia. If you had walked the docks of New York or San Francisco in the 1880s, you would have seen the Studebaker name stamped on thousands of wooden crates, waiting for the next ship. The company built a dealer network that stretched across every state and territory in the Union, ensuring that if a man needed a wagon anywhere in the West, he could find a Studebaker dealer. They had moved from the anvil to the empire, creating a level of saturation that few brands would ever match. But as the brothers stood at this absolute zenith of the horse-drawn age, the merciless arithmetic of history was already preparing a new challenge. They had perfected the wagon, but they were unaware that the very success they celebrated was anchoring them to a world that was about to disappear. The industrial ambition that had carried them from a $68 beginning to global kings was about to collide with the arrival of the motor age. The cathedral was strong, the workers were loyal, and the name meant quality. But the horse, as John Moeller would soon realize, was doomed. By the late 1890s, the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company was the undisputed king of the dirt road. They were shipping 75,000 wagons a year to every corner of the globe, from the ports of Europe to the mountains of South America. From the outside, the empire looked unassailable, a monument to industrial ambition that had conquered the horse-drawn age. But inside the industrial cathedral in South Bend, one man was watching the horizon with the grit and obsession of a true visionary. John Moeller Studebaker, the man who had funded the family's expansion with his $8,000 gold rush fortune, saw the unmistakable reality of a changing world. He watched the first horseless carriages sputtering and coughing through American streets. While most wagon manufacturers laughed at these unreliable machines, John Moeller did not. In 1897, he made a declaration that shocked his entire management team and signaled the end of an era. The horse is doomed. He was running the most successful wagon company on earth, yet he was betting everything that his entire product line was about to become obsolete. It was a moment of merciless arithmetic. He knew that if Studebaker didn't lead the transition to the motor age, they would be buried by it. The transition began not with a roar, but with a whisper. In 1902, Studebaker entered the automobile business not with gasoline, but with electricity. They partnered with established electric car makers, targeting wealthy urban residents and doctors who appreciated a vehicle that ran whisper quiet and didn't require the dangerous hand cranking of early gas engines. These early Studebaker electrics were marvels of mechanical precision, but they were trapped by the unforgiving mathematics of their own batteries. With a range of only 40 miles before the power died, they were city toys, unable to conquer the vast distances of the American landscape. By 1904, the company recognized that the future belonged to the internal combustion engine. They formed a strategic partnership with the Garford Company of Ohio, a move that created a strange industrial hybrid. Garford would build the mechanical guts, the engines and chassis, while Studebaker would apply 60 years of carriage-building expertise to create stunning automobile bodies in South Bend. It was an era of organized chaos, as craftsmen who had spent decades shaping wood now learned to fit steel. These early gasoline models were positioned as luxury items, handcrafted with the same attention to detail that had made the family's wagons legendary. But John Moeller understood that being a coach builder for someone else's engines was a technology trap. To control their own destiny, Studebaker needed to own the engineering. In 1908, they made a bold, decisive move and purchased the EMF company, which stood for Everett Metzger Flanders, a Detroit automaker with real engineering capability. This acquisition changed the company's trajectory forever. Suddenly, Studebaker had in-house experts who understood transmissions, drivetrains, and suspension systems. They were no longer just decorating a platform, they were building the machine. By 1911, the company felt confident enough to end the Garford partnership and build complete automobiles independently from the ground up. To fuel this industrial ambition, they established a massive factory complex in Detroit in 1912 to complement the South Bend operation. The rhythm of hammers was now the heartbeat of a dual-city empire. Then came the moment of the final thunk. In 1913, Studebaker made the most agonizing decision in its history. After 60 years of building the finest wooden vehicles in the world, the company ceased all wagon production permanently. The blacksmith's oath was now being sworn to the assembly line. The horse really was doomed, and the Cathedral of South Bend was now fully committed to a race against giants like Henry Ford and Cadillac. They had successfully transformed from blacksmiths to wagon builders and now to automakers, unaware that the unforgiving mathematics of this new industry would eventually bring their 114-year-old empire to its knees. By the late 1920s, the Industrial Cathedral in South Bend, Indiana, had achieved a level of dominance that felt as permanent as the Indiana limestone foundations of its buildings. After making the agonizing choice to abandon their 60-year tradition of wagon building in 1913, the Studebaker brothers had successfully pivoted to the unforgiving mathematics of the internal combustion engine. By 1927, the factory had become a monument to industrial ambition, producing over 180,000 vehicles a year, the highest output the company had ever achieved to that point. At this peak, the company's worth exceeded $100 million, a staggering sum that signaled Studebaker was no longer a local shop, but a global titan of transportation. To walk the perimeter of the South Bend complex in 1928 was to witness a city within a city at full stride. The air was a thick, sensory cocktail of lacquer, coal smoke, and hot iron, vibrating with the rhythm of hammers that never paused for 3 shifts a day. Inside the 6 million square foot facility, the grit and obsession of the workforce was visible in every spark of a welding torch and every rhythmic thud of the pneumatic presses. More than 15,000 workers flooded through the gates daily, their lives organized by the merciless arithmetic of the factory whistle. In South Bend, a Studebaker badge number was not just a means of identification, it was a family inheritance. This was the era of the American Industrial Compact in its most optimistic form. It was the unmistakable reality of the era that 3 generations could often be found working under the same roof. A grandfather who had once forged the wooden wheels of the company's legendary wagons, a father who had mastered the precision assembly of the Big Six engine, and a son just starting his first shift on the chassis line. They shared a craft, an identity, and a profound belief that if they stayed loyal to the company would protect them forever. The factory floor was a linguistic kaleidoscope, a place where the immigrant dream was being hammered into shape. You could hear a dozen languages, Polish, Hungarian, and German, shouted over the roar of the machinery as workers traded the dirt of European farms for the organized chaos of the assembly line. They were building cars like the President and the Commander machines that stood for quality and craftsmanship. The company's motto, "Always give more than you promise," wasn't just a marketing slogan. It was the sacred oath of the forge applied to a mass-market machine, and the workers took immense pride in the industrial poetry of a perfectly fitted door. The plant didn't just provide the means to live, it organized the very rhythm of time for every soul in the city. The factory whistle was the voice of South Bend. When it blew in the pre-dawn gray, the entire neighborhood woke up. When it blew at noon, the local diners filled with a sea of men in gray coveralls. When it blew at 3 in the afternoon, the streets became a river of humanity, a flood of fathers walking home to families who knew their future was secure because the rhythm of hammers was constant. The company reinforced this loyalty through an unprecedented social infrastructure. Studebaker sponsored athletic leagues, built parks for the community, and maintained a massive dealer network of over 5,000 locations nationwide. For the families of South Bend, the factory was their anchor, a concrete palace that provided a pathway to the American middle class. As the parking lots filled with gleaming new sedans and the profits rolled in, no one standing in the Industrial Cathedral in 1928 could have imagined the unforgiving mathematics of the future. They were at their absolute zenith, unaware that the roar of the furnaces was about to be met by a silence so profound it would threaten to erase their names from history. The blacksmith's oath looked unassailable, but the merciless arithmetic of a changing world was already beginning to shift, setting a technology trap that would one day turn this cathedral of light into a monument to abandonment. By October 1929, the industrial cathedral in South Bend, was standing at the edge of a precipice that no amount of blacksmith pride could avoid. When the stock market crashed, the merciless arithmetic of the Great Depression spared no one, but it hit the independent automakers with a particular targeted violence. Between 1929 and 1932, automobile sales across America didn't just dip, they collapsed by 75%. For a company that had seen its worth exceed $100 million just years earlier, the silence that began to settle over the 6 million square feet of factory floor was an unmistakable reality of impending death. By 1933, the cash reserves were gone, and Studebaker was forced into receivership, a form of bankruptcy protection that allowed the company to keep its lights on while it figured out how to pay back a world that no longer had money to spend. This was the moment Paul Hoffman took the reins as president. Hoffman was not a man of sentiment. He was a man of the unforgiving mathematics of survival. He began swinging an axe through the corporate structure, cutting costs with a grit and obsession that bordered on the fanatical. He renegotiated every contract, shuttered every unprofitable satellite operation, and streamlined the hierarchy until the company was lean enough to draw a single, shallow breath of air. Against all odds, Studebaker emerged from receivership in 1935, one of the only independent automakers to survive the economic apocalypse that had buried names with much longer histories. But Hoffman knew that merely existing wasn't enough to beat the giants in Detroit. To survive the industrial aftermath of the 30s, Studebaker needed a miracle of design. In 1939, they found their prophet in Raymond Loewy. Loewy was an industrial designer who had already reshaped the look of the modern world, from locomotives to refrigerators, and he brought a philosophy to South Bend that shocked the conservative Big Three automakers. Weight is the enemy. While Ford and General Motors were doubling down on heavy, boxy machines loaded with unnecessary chrome, Loewy and his team were drafting the industrial poetry of the 1939 Champion. The Champion was designed with horizontal lines that flowed from front to back, with integrated fenders that made it look like it was moving while standing still. It was a car that rejected the excess of the past for a sleek, aerodynamic future. Inside the factory, the organized chaos of production was retooled for this new vision. The Champion wasn't just a triumph of aesthetics, it was a masterpiece of merciless arithmetic. Because Loewy had stripped away the dead weight of traditional design, the car was incredibly light, allowing it to achieve a revolutionary 25 to 30 miles per gallon. In an era where working families were still counting every penny in their pockets, a stylish car that didn't drain the wallet at the fuel pump was more than a product, it was a lifeline. The gamble on the Champion paid off with a speed that stunned the industry. In 1939, the same year of its launch, the Cathedral of South Bend finally returned to profitability. The rhythm of hammers was no longer a dirge for a dying brand, but a heartbeat of a company that had looked into the abyss of the Depression and refused to blink. By the end of that year, Studebaker was once again a contender, proving that innovation and a refusal to follow the boxiness of the giants could still win in the American marketplace. They had survived the silence, unaware that their greatest test, the transition from the arsenal of expansion to the jet age, was still waiting on the horizon. On December 7, 1941, the industrial cathedral of South Bend felt the world shift beneath its foundations. By February 1942, the United States government issued a decree that would silence the civilian dreams of every automaker in the nation. All production of private vehicles was to cease immediately. For Studebaker, this wasn't just a pause in business. It was an invitation to join the arsenal of democracy and prove the grit and obsession of the Indiana workforce on a global stage. The transition was nothing short of stunning, occurring not in years, but in a matter of weeks, as the 6 million square foot plant retooled for the machinery of total war. Workers who had spent their lives installing leather seats and polishing chrome fenders suddenly found themselves measuring tolerances for the Wright Cyclone aircraft engines that powered the Boeing B-17 bombers. The rhythm of hammers changed from a domestic song to a martial drum beat as the plant produced thousands of these massive power plants under license, fueling the Allied air campaign over Europe. Beyond the skies, Studebaker engineers turned their attention to the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. They developed and manufactured the Weasel, a tracked vehicle designed to traverse snow and swamps where wheeled machines would simply sink into an unmistakable reality of failure. But the true monument to industrial ambition forged in South Bend during these years was a machine that would become a legend in the farthest corners of the world, the US 6 2.5-ton 6x6 truck. Between 1941 and 1945, the South Bend lines turned out over 200,000 of these specialized military vehicles. While the Big Three in Detroit were building for the American Army, Studebaker became the primary lifeline for an ally fighting a desperate war of survival on the other side of the planet. Under the Lend-Lease program, the vast majority of these 200,000 trucks were shipped to the Soviet Union, where they encountered the merciless arithmetic of the Eastern Front. The Russian soldiers, stunned by the mechanical integrity of the Indiana-built machines, gave them a nickname that would stick for generations: Studers. These weren't just transport vehicles. They were the backbone of the Soviet military supply lines, driven along the Leningrad Road through mud so deep it swallowed German tanks, and in cold so intense it froze lesser engines solid. The Studers kept rolling when everything else stopped, defying the mud and the German artillery fire with a legendary reliability that made them a symbol of American support. After the war, Soviet generals would openly credit the Studebaker truck as a decisive factor in the defeat of Germany, citing its ability to keep supplies flowing to frontline troops when nothing else could get through. Inside the concrete palace in South Bend, the war years brought a peak of industrial pride and a financial windfall that exceeded $30 million in profit. This wasn't just money. It was a technology trap disguised as success, as the workforce mastered precision manufacturing techniques and high-volume quality control that made them feel invincible. The veterans who returned to Russia and Eastern Europe carried stories of the Studers that lasted for decades, and old Studebaker trucks could still be found running in remote Russian villages well into the 1980s. In the Middle East and Africa, the legacy of this wartime durability persisted because the machines were simple enough to repair without a sophisticated parts network, a testament to the blacksmith's oath to always give more than you promise. By 1945, Studebaker emerged from the conflict not as a struggling independent, but as an industrial titan positioned for the biggest automotive boom in history. They had the capital, they had the reputation, and they had spent the war years secretly designing the bullet-nose future of the American road, while their competitors were still focused on the battlefield. They were the kings of the arsenal of wings and the masters of the Leningrad Road, unaware that the very scale and complexity of the war effort had rewired the industry into a giant's game they were not, yet equipped to play forever. In April 1947, a bomb dropped on the American automobile industry, and it wasn't launched from Detroit. It came from South Bend, Indiana. While the Big Three were still scrambling to retool their factories and figure out how to satisfy a car-hungry post-war public with warmed-over pre-war designs, Studebaker unveiled a machine that made people stop and stare in the streets. Raymond Loewy had created a design so radical that observers famously asked, "Which way is it going?" The 1947 Studebaker featured a bullet nose that looked like it had been stripped off a fighter plane and a wraparound rear window that redefined automotive visibility. It was the first truly new post-war car in America, and it landed Studebaker on the cover of Time magazine. Their advertising hammered the advantage home with a slogan that twisted the knife into their competitors. First by far with a post-war car. It was a monument to industrial ambition, proving that an independent from Indiana could outthink and outmaneuver the giants of the Motor City. By 1950, the Cathedral of South Bend reached its absolute high-water mark. That year, the factory turned out a record-breaking 343,000 vehicles, a number that remains an all-time company record. Studebaker had captured a staggering 4.02% of the total American market. Inside the 6 million square foot complex, the rhythm of hammers was a constant, deafening roar as 23,000 workers operated across 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. For the families of South Bend, this was the peak of the American Industrial Compact. Annual profits exceeded $20 million, and the company stood proudly as the 8th largest automaker in America. They weren't just building cars, they were building an identity. Studebaker diversified aggressively, producing a truck line to challenge Ford and Chevrolet, while models like the Champion, Commander, and Land Cruiser dominated the middle market. In 1952, they even beat the giants to the punch again, offering the first American production V8 engine in a compact car. But the true industrial poetry arrived in 1953 with the Starliner Coupe. Automotive journalists immediately hailed it as the most beautiful car of the 1950s. With a low, sleek profile influenced by European sports cars, the Starliner was a sculpture on wheels that won design awards across the globe and became a cultural icon that transcended mere transportation. Yet, standing at this absolute zenith of power and prestige, the unforgiving mathematics of the future were already being calculated in the dark corners of the plant. While the cars were masterpieces of design, the factory was becoming a technology trap. Studebaker was still relying on the aging South Bend facility, while Ford and General Motors were pouring billions into massive automated plants. The merciless arithmetic of scale was beginning to bite. Because Studebaker produced 300,000 cars instead of 3 million, their per-unit labor costs were 10 to 15% higher than their competitors. The American Industrial Compact, those generous labor contracts that had built the South Bend middle class, were becoming an anchor. Management and labor both assumed the harvest would remain abundant forever, ignoring the unmistakable reality that their thin margins were one recession away from a death spiral. In 1953, as the Starliner gleamed under the showroom lights, Studebaker looked unassailable. They had outproduced the impossible and engineered the future, unaware that the very excellence they celebrated was the final glow of a fire that was about to be extinguished by the cold logic of industrial aftermath. By 1954, the boardrooms of South Bend were filled with a heavy, artificial optimism that masked a scent of impending rot. The cathedral of South Bend was bleeding, and the merciless arithmetic of the post-war market was closing in. Management knew that to survive against the giants of the Motor City, they needed a lifeline. They found it in the Packard Motor Company. On paper, it was a synergy of legends, the rugged reliability of the wagon builder merging with the refined luxury of the concrete palace. In reality, it was a poison pill that would accelerate the end of both empires. Industry analysts at the time didn't mince their words. They described the merger as the minnow swallowing the whale. James Nance, the man from Packard who took the helm of the newly formed Studebaker Packard Corporation, projected a steel-jawed confidence to the press. But behind the closed doors of the 6 million square foot complex, he was staring at an unmistakable reality. Packard wasn't the savior they had prayed for. It was a ghost of its former self. It brought with it outdated factories that required an impossible amount of capital to retool, but far worse was the discovery of a mountain of hidden debt that Studebaker's already strained accounts could not possibly carry. The unforgiving mathematics of the merger were immediate and staggering. In 1954, the combined corporation hemorrhaged $30 million. The following year, in 1955, the ledger continued to bleed another $30 million as the American Industrial Compact began to shred. While the executives in South Bend were struggling to integrate 2 entirely different corporate cultures, the Big Three in Detroit General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were launching an aggressive, scorched-earth campaign of price wars. Because Ford and General Motors could spread their fixed costs across 3 million cars, they could drop their prices to levels that were physically impossible for an independent manufacturer to match. Studebaker's per-unit production costs were 10 to 15% higher than their rivals. It was a race they were losing before the first bolt was even tightened on the assembly line. By 1956, the desperation in the plant had a new name: the Scotsman. It was a car born from a radical, hollowed-out philosophy. In a bid to save every penny of industrial ambition, they stripped the car down to its bare, functional skeleton. There was no chrome trim, no luxury features, and they even removed the armrests for the passengers. They marketed it to the most frugal buyers in America, but in doing so, they committed a cardinal sin of branding. They traded a century of reputation for quality for a few thousand quick sales, and the unforgiving mathematics of the market punished them. The Scotsman didn't save the company. It merely signaled to the world that the Studebaker name was now a badge of the budget-constrained. Then, in a final brilliant flash of grit and obsession, came the Avanti in 1962. This was the masterpiece of Raymond Loewy, a car designed to look like it was already moving at 100 miles per hour while parked. It featured a fiberglass body, disc brakes, and a supercharged V8 engine that set 29 speed records at the Bonneville Salt Flats. It was the most innovative car in America, a monument to industrial ambition that should have been the turning point for the Cathedral of South Bend. But once again, the unmistakable reality of the factory floor intervened. The aging plant was not equipped for the organized chaos of fiberglass production. Manufacturing delays stretched from weeks into months as the company struggled to master the difficult chemistry of the car's body. Customers who had put down deposits for the future found themselves waiting in the silence of a present that was rapidly evaporating. Only 3,834 Avantis were ever produced, not even close to the numbers needed to break even. The rhythm of hammers was now becoming a funeral dirge. The Studebaker name, which had carried soldiers through the Civil War and the mud of the Eastern Front, was being erased by the cold, secondary logic of a merger that offered no protection. They had gambled on scale, they had gambled on frugality, and they had gambled on a supercar. But the house always wins when the merciless arithmetic of the industry decides that your time is up. The lights in South Bend were dimming, and the silence of the industrial aftermath was only a few shifts away. As we returned to that bitter afternoon on December 20th, 1963, we witnessed the final, gasping breath of an industrial cathedral. The rhythm of hammers that had pulsed through South Bend, Indiana, for 111 years was reaching its terminal conclusion. As the last car, a modest Lark sedan, moved toward the end of the assembly line, the 7,000 workers remaining in the plant didn't cheer. They stood in a heavy, expectant silence, listening to the mechanical heartbeat of their city fade into the unmistakable reality of an ending. When that final vehicle reached the shipping dock and the last inspector stepped away, a worker reached out and swung the driver's side door shut. That final thunk, the sound of Studebaker quality, echoed through 6 million square feet of factory space, a sound that carried the weight of the Civil War, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression. Then, at 4 o'clock, the switches were flipped, the electrical hum died, the welding torches flickered out. The Cathedral of South Bend went dark, leaving 7,000 families to face the merciless arithmetic of a Christmas without a paycheck. The aftermath was a slow-motion erasure of a city's identity. South Bend's unemployment rate jumped from 4% to 12%, literally overnight. The city lost 25% of its manufacturing tax base in a single year, becoming the very place where economists would eventually coin the term Rust Belt to describe the hollowing out of the American heartland. For decades, the plant sat as a monument to abandonment. Windows were shattered by vandals, copper wiring was stripped by scavengers, and the roofs of those massive brick buildings began to collapse under the weight of Indiana winters. The 6 million square foot complex, once the source of global pride, became a landscape of dust and ghosts. Today, a new chapter is being written on that haunted ground. The Renaissance District has begun to scrub the earth clean, converting the old administration building where executives once made the Studebaker Packard gamble into luxury lofts and tech offices. The Studebaker National Museum now stands nearby, preserving the bullet nose models and the Starliner masterpieces behind glass, turning a living industry into a photo opportunity for tourists. But for the older residents who still walk these streets, the unmistakable reality of silence is still haunted by the ghost of the factory whistle, a sound that once told an entire city when to wake, when to eat, and when to dream. The true tragedy of Studebaker, and the central lesson of this industrial aftermath, is that innovation alone cannot defeat the structural reality of scale. Studebaker was right about almost everything. They were right about the doomed horse in 1897. They were right about fuel efficiency with the Champion in 1939. They were right about radical design with the bullet nose and the Avanti. They proved that ordinary people could create extraordinary things through grit and obsession. But in the world of global capitalism, being right is only half the equation. They were a minnow trying to swallow a whale, caught in a technology trap, where their output of 100,000 cars a year simply could not compete with the 3 million units of the giants. They were too small to be a titan and too large to remain a boutique. They proved that even a century of giving more than you promise offers no protection when the unforgiving mathematics of the future decide your time is up. Soon, the last of the original brick will be gone, and only the stories will remain. Studebaker is gone, but the lesson endures. Excellence is not a shield against the horizon. I'm your host, and this has been Industrial Aftermath. If you believe these stories of fire, precision, and the silence of the forge are worth remembering, leave a like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments if your father or grandfather ever told you about the day the whistle stopped blowing in South Bend. Thank you for watching.